I'm Doc Shauna Springer. I'm one of the world's leading experts in anxiety and trauma. What I've learned from working with people at the extremes, our nation's warriors and their families, can help us all right now. Today on the Leadership and Loyalty podcast, I'll be talking about COVID-19 anxiety and how we can cope and lead ourselves through this time of crisis.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron, is the founder of FullMontyLeadership.com. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. I'm your host, Dov Baron, the Dragonist, and I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. To find out more, you can simply go to dovbaron.com. Let me ask you, in what ways do you need to up-level your leadership? Well, as we record this, the entire globe is being forced into a complete and unexpected, almost total halt. So what are you doing to develop transitional agility? Well, stay tuned because you're about to find out. You can chat about this episode or any past episodes inside of our Facebook and LinkedIn groups. Simply go look for Leadership and Loyalty Podcast. If you're a new listener, new viewer, thank you for joining us. Strap yourself in. We're about to go full Monty. As always, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever it is that you tune into radio or podcasts. As always, we appreciate your comments and feedback, and we always need your help in staying relevant. So please get over to wherever you tune in, rate, review, and subscribe. You can also catch us on Google Home and Alexa by simply saying play Dov Baron podcast. And we are entirely grateful if you're a regular listener, because of you, we've become the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners with a potential reach of 2.5 to 4 million listeners for every single show. We're honored to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. So again, thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. Transitions take place all day, every day. And under normal circumstances, most of them go pretty much unnoticed. And unless there is a more major transition, like going into a new role or getting a promotion or getting laid off or getting divorced or getting married, all these are transitions, and most of them are pretty much minimized by most of us, unless, of course, we're the one going through the transition. Today, as we record this, we find ourselves in a world where not just jobs and status are in transition, but rather where the entire world, our entire way of being has changed, and we're likely to continue in ways that we've never even imagined. I believe that we are on the brink of an epidemic of what I believe will be a mass identity crisis that will create a dramatic transition PTSD, some form of that. And we better know how to deal with it. That's why our guest on this episode is Dr. Shauna Springer. Now, Doc Springer is known for pop culture and mainstream insights in psychology and interpersonal relationships affecting all people, originating from what she has gleaned with over 2 decades of work at the extremes. Dr. Shauna Springer is a graduate of Harvard University and is one of the world's leading experts on PTSD and transitional trauma. She co-hosts a weekly podcast on these topics, collaborating with the Military Times. Her work has been featured on NPR, NBC, CBS Radio, Forbes, The Washington Post, the Military Times, and she is a regular contributor to Psychology Today. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me welcome Doc Shauna Springer! And the crowd still are going wild.
Oh, I needed that humor.
Good. I'm glad you're here. And we all need you right now. We need you really well. But before we start, our question that we like to start the show with, because I think it it sort of brings things into center, and that is this. When you think about who has had impact on you, who's been a massive influence in your life around leadership, in your leading yourself, leading others, who is that person that we might not think of, that maybe we might not even know? Who's that? Who would that be for you?
I would say Colonel Scott Jensen is that person for me. He was the head of Marine Corps Behavioral Health for many years. I know him as somebody who leads from the front. And in the military, that means that you lead by example. You don't stand back and let other people take the risks. You get up there and you do the hard thing, and the thing that's unpopular because it's the right thing. And I think that's what inspires loyalty in other people. So Colonel Jensen, my friend Scott, is one of the leaders I look up to.
So how does that apply in the context of what it is that you do? Because, you know, you're working with so many of these military, right from the frontline warriors to the top of the scale leaders. How does that apply for you?
Yeah, so for my leadership, it helps me to remember that leadership is about being transparent. It's about getting in the foxhole with people. It's about doing what you would ask others to do. I just was at a retreat actually when the world seemed to kind of fall apart, with a group of about 10 of my favorite Marines, and we did some really interesting things that week. One of the things we had to do was kind of gentle some wild Mustangs. So they put us in a round pen with these huge horses that had been traumatized, and there was a horse whisperer that gave us some coaching on how to gentle them. And they threw us in there in that round pen, and we had to figure it out with that coaching. We had to do a leap of faith where we had to jump off of this huge, it was just a tiny pedestal on a huge kind of telephone pole. And that was terrifying to me. But I did it because I will not ask other people to do things that I was not willing to do myself. And so halfway through the week, the civilian support staff left, and we were at a decision point. Do we stay and finish the program, which was the most impactful thing these Marines had ever done? Or do we tell people to catch early flights and get home? And we put it to a vote, and everybody decided to stay, and it was amazing. So I think, you know, I was there with the Master Sergeant. Actually, he and I were both there. We had built trust with these Marines, and it was another example in, you don't ask other people to do things you're not willing to do yourself. We can lead by example.
You know, I love that, and I absolutely believe that that's true. You don't have the right to ask anybody to do what you're not willing to do. And you know, today, as the world is very different than it was even a month ago, as we record this, you know, we are all having to do things that are uncomfortable. I said recently in an interview that COVID-19 has pushed us all into the future. And what I mean by that is it might feel like we've all gone backwards in time, that, you know, we can't do a lot of things we used to do, but it's pushed us into using technology. It's pushed us into having to step up in places that we wouldn't normally, that we might hand off to another person, and we're not doing that. And I think that that's, you know, it's a great example of what you were talking about. Now, over the years, I've spent time, I've interviewed many leaders with military backgrounds, including several Navy SEALs and generals. And oftentimes I think the message that gets out there from the context of leadership from the military is that there's a lack of resilience. Do you think that resilience is the answer to today's crisis, or do you think it's something else altogether?
Well, one of the things about resilience is a lot of service members and veterans kind of hate the term. You know, what they tell me, I got curious about this. What they tell me is that it brings to mind either pride, that you're resilient when someone else is not, and that's not how they think, or that you're resilient until you're not. And so even the term—
That's great. Just stop there for a minute. You're resilient until you're not. I wonder how many of us can really take that in. That's why I don't want to go past that, because that's one of those that could like, oh, did we catch that? You're resilient till you're not. You can keep going, you can do things until there's nothing left, and then you have to stop.
Yeah. I've worked with the strongest and bravest people in our society, and what I've learned from people at the extremes is that no one is immune to this kind of stress. The kind of stress that Americans are feeling right now is something that military veterans have felt for many years. Our nation's warriors have been steeped in this kind of stress for many years. Crisis, transition from the military, sometimes deployments, these kinds of traumas, all forming a perfect storm. We've had the strongest and bravest face this for many years.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I wanted to talk to you in the context of this is because, you and I had talked about transition and the transition out of the military into the civvy world, and that is not unlike a corporate leader transitioning out, even leaving from being the identity of the CEO or the proprietor out into the world and what comes next. But we are now in massive transition, everybody. And a lot of that is at identity level. A lot of that is, well, I was this and I could go there and I could do that. Now I can't. Who am I if I'm not that becomes the question. So the identity crisis is part of what you call walking the wasteland of transition for leaders in corporate and military sectors. What if you were just sort of giving, like, here's the piece you need to have right now, what would that be?
Well, one of the biggest mistakes people make is to think that they're invulnerable to stress, or to think that they should navigate these kinds of transitions as an army of one. The best leaders that I know that they also need their tribe.
Yes.
When we connect, we survive. And so the best leaders I know are transparent about where they're struggling. They are vulnerable. They take their armor off with others, but they have a plan, and they exercise competence in coming up with a plan that helps people control what they can control.
So that's interesting, isn't it? Because again, I've spoken about this many times in the context of vulnerability, that I think that we tend to look at these kinds of people, and I think it's Hollywood who's done it, but we tend to look at these people and say, well, they never show vulnerability. And in my interviews with with some amazing military leaders, as I said, SEALs, I just very recently interviewed Mark Devine.
I did too, about a week ago.
Right. So I very recently, we talked about therapy and having therapy and the need for therapy, and in the context of, to be a great leader, you need to deal with your crap and get it out of the way. And, and I made him stop so that all of us could listen again, that he's saying, you got to do therapy. And here's a Navy SEAL. Right? We don't think of those people as being that way, but it's really important to understand that, one of my terms is, you can box everything up, but all those boxes leak. You can't fully compartmentalize anything. And so you actually have to open the box and get the crap out of there and wash it out in order to move forward in a healthy, functional way. But at this point, Shauna, this is what I want to bring to you, is we are in the midst of the battle. For many people, it's how they feel.
Yeah.
They are in the trauma, they're in the stress.
Yeah.
And they don't know how to put it to the side, not box it off, but put it to the side. They're consumed by the stress. Mm-hmm. They only know how to be consumed by the stress. And yet, I did a video I put out this morning where I talked about essential services and essential people. And I said that I think that a leadership is an essential service. Because you have to lead people who are in stress and trauma right now. What would be your first clue in how we can help people who are front line with the stress, with the trauma, with the crises?
Well, you're right about the identity crisis that people are having. That is very well put. I think anxiety creates tunnel vision. Yes. And so to the degree that we drop into that survival mode, that fight or flight mode, we don't see the big picture.
Right.
Yet that's exactly what leaders need to be doing right now, to come up with a plan for what they can control. One of the things that Commander Devine said in the interview he did for the podcast I do for Military Times is that the people that detach and they come home after battles and they play video games. Just disassociate from it and detach. We're not the ones who coped well. So we need to connect. Instead of doing that, the people that connected with each other, that found humor and trust with each other and talked about where they were at and, yes, destroyed the myth of invulnerability, were the people that thrived through crisis. So being able to reflect on where we're at, acknowledge that, but stay connected and form a plan for what we can control is critical right now.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because it brings up something that's really vital here, and that is that we, right now, of course, we're doing this social distancing and to some degree isolation, depending on how expensive this gets. And at the same time, you and I are talking about the need for community. So, you know, I've put out many ideas about how we can have community even at a distance. What's your thoughts on community, and how can we better do that?
You know, I understand why people came up with the hashtag social distancing. It's quick and it's short, but I wish that they had come up with something a little different. I wish that instead of social distancing, people had thought of connecting from a distance. It's a different concept. Social distancing tells you what to do. It tells you to stay back and keep people 6 feet away. Connecting from a distance says you need to reorient and be creative about the ways that you connect, but you need to proactively do this.
Yeah.
So we can do it in low-tech ways. We can go old school and send a letter. I've been encouraging people to come up with a list of 20 people that they care about, and then add 3 more to that list. People that they know are especially socially isolated right now. Maybe someone who just went through a divorce or lives in a city where they have no roommates. Put those people on that list, and then they can take their phone out and put a rotating reminder in their phone to call one of those people every day. And it's not just to talk and vent and unload our own stress. It's to give other people space to listen so that we can allow them space to think about where they're at and come up with a plan. That's the kind of trust and connection that we need to be doing. And we can use lots of tools that we have. Thank goodness we have the tools.
Yeah.
But we don't have to depend on the tools. We can write people a letter, and it may be even more effective.
You know, that's very interesting. I really believe that, I mean, you know this certainly as well, and maybe much better than I do, that the whole thing around, I've done a lot of stuff on military suicide. I know you've been involved in that, and we've looked at the trauma side of things and addictions, of course. And what we know is at the root of it is a lack of community, because the identity had a community and the identity's gone, therefore the community's gone, and we have to create community. But community, of course, ideally is we're all in the same room and we're having a cup of coffee, or we're having dinner, or having a beverage, or whatever it might be. But that's not available to you right now. But it doesn't mean you can't have community. And I think, do you think it's easier though for people to make up the excuse to not connect, because like I've got friends who run 12-step programs who have started 12-step programs online, which is pretty amazing, right? Whereas instead of all being in a shitty basement sitting around on plastic chairs, they're actually doing it online.
Yeah.
Do you think it's just going to become another excuse though to not connect?
For some people, it already is. I spoke to a VA therapist who is an Army Reserve officer, and she said that many of her patients are coming in right now, and they're saying the nightmares are coming back, and I'm isolating myself in my house, and I'm doing perimeter checks. So that is happening. And for those people, I would say, there's trauma. This is echoing trauma. A lot of what's happening, now is familiar to many veterans, because there's this invisible enemy, this threat that we can't see, this need to be constantly hypervigilant, the fear about, what if something blows up, what if somebody gets really sick in my family or in my own life, having to do without basic necessities as part of deployment. There's just so many things that are going to be triggering this trauma. And now our first responders are new veterans. And they have so many of the same trauma triggers now that our veterans have had for many years. And they are the tip of the spear in this battle. They must not fall. We must support them or we'll all fall. And so they are watching their colleagues fall ill. They are in there without sufficient supplies to protect them. They are seeing traumas that are burning themselves into their minds that they'll never forget. They're worried about the impact of their jobs and the risks they're bringing into their families. These are all experiences that our military service members and veterans have felt for many years. And then we're all in the midst of this identity crisis, as you put it. And so there's a lot of trauma out there. So I think, from my perspective, it's about really helping people have insight into the deeper psychology of why this is so traumatic for us, and then calling them to action. Don't sit in your foxhole and wait for someone to call you. There are people that are isolated, and you can be doing something about that. And if you do that, you'll feel better and get on a path that will be good for you as well.
Yeah. You said something there that I think is important. Of course, there is a very direct line between military trauma and people on the front line right now with what they're doing. Absolutely. But you also said something else in there, and that was that this is going to trigger familiar trauma. And I want to bring this up to people because I want, you may not be a frontline worker right now. You might be in a leadership position. You might be a manager or leader in some way, shape, or form, and you are feeling traumatized, and you're likely feeling some level of anxiety, and you go, well, I'm not frontline, and I don't have the right to feel this. And I think what Dr. Springer said to you is very important for you to realize, and it's the word familiar. Familiar coming from the Latin familiar, meaning family. And so that means the place of origin. So there is likely, there's an origin story somewhere in you where you were traumatized, and this is likely to trigger that. Because oftentimes what I've found in my 35 years of doing this work is that many people who end up in leadership roles are people who had traumatic backgrounds. They are people who built resilience and did the things they needed to do to excel in the world in order to cope. And the problem is that many of them, and I've been talking about this for years, this is just bringing it to the surface. The problem is many of them have never dealt with their crap. And so they've never dealt with that crap. And now here's something that pushes them into a place of massive uncertainty.
Yep.
And so the traumas come back, and it's like living with your alcoholic dad, or it's like living with your abusive mom, or whatever it is, and or your granddad, or that teacher at school, or whatever it was, and it's coming back. And I want you as a leader to grasp what Dr. Sean is sharing with us here, and that is that this is going to bring your stuff up, and you have to deal with that. And I know you did a big town hall for a congressman about anxiety. And you did this for, I can't remember how many people you said it was for, but it was a huge amount of people. Tell us a little bit about dealing with that anxiety so that people can grasp that this is not, you don't have to actually be in the trauma of it to be triggered to the anxiety of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually probably worse for some people because they feel so helpless. It is harder for many of us to do nothing than to do something really hard.
Yes.
You're absolutely right that many of our leaders have been developed in the fire of adversity, that this will scrape people raw, including our leaders. And an added dimension, there's two added dimensions. The first is that leaders will feel a helpless rage that they can't protect those they feel responsible for. I know that business owners are going to have to let some people go, and those people may feel like family to them. They may feel like people we've taken under our wings. And so having to make those impossible decisions where your basic values are in conflict, you have to survive economically, but you also want to protect your people, are putting people in a lot of no-win scenarios right now. But leaders also feel this sense of responsibility to people while they feel they sometimes can't open up, that they feel like they have to lead. So that means that they can't acknowledge their own trauma or find a safe place to work on that, or really address that head on. And leaders need to do that. One of the most inspiring leaders that I know, again, this one's someone in the Marine Corps. It's a master sergeant in the Marine Corps, has influenced thousands upon thousands of Marines by sharing his own story and making it okay, giving permission to people to name their nameless anxiety. That's what I think leaders can do for everyone, and they can do it for themselves. They must do it for themselves as well right now.
Name the nameless anxiety. Give us an example of that. That's really good. I want people to get that. Can you give us an example of that so that, a leader watching, could be, like I said, a manager, could be a CEO, could be anybody, could be a leader of a family is watching this right now.
Well, let's take your example. Yeah, let's take your example of somebody who came from the fires of adversity into a leadership position. Let's say that their family wasn't well resourced and they grew up poor and they really decided, I'm going to lead, I'm going to create jobs and opportunities for people, and I'm going to take care of my people. And then because the economy is impacted by everybody being at home right now, they now have to lay off a huge amount of their workforce. That can bring up a lot of anxiety from their past trauma in terms of, it's happening, I've failed, I can't protect people, I can't predict or control my situation or protect the people I love. And that can drill right down into someone's heart and really affect them. So that could be the anxiety for them, that I have no control and I can't protect those that I love. Putting a name on that and then thinking about what is under my control is really helpful, I think, right now.
Yeah, I do too. And it's, for me, one of the things I say is that it's important for us to recognize the reflections of the past in the present. And what I mean by that is that you're feeling something, but by asking this question, as you are in whatever you're in, because I'm going through it, you're going through it, we're all going through it, which is, what does this remind me of?
Yes.
For me is so powerful, because I'm like, oh crap, it's like when I was a kid, when this was happening, or when that was happening, or, and when I ask people, what does this remind you of? They usually say something that was recent. And then I go, but go back all the way. And okay. And they get to that and they go, oh my God, it's like that. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is like that. And now what's the difference? And people go, well, it's different because it's economics, or it's different because it's the government, or it's different because it's a pandemic. I go, yeah, all those things are different. But let me tell you the one major difference. And they go, what? You were a child and you didn't have the control. And now you do. Now you have the power to say, you know what? I can decide how this is.
That's right.
I can do what I can do. And like you said, that's where can I take the control?
That is spot on. What this reminds me of, to share an example from my history, is I was a kid, high school, when the LA riots happened. And people were told that they had to stay in their houses. And we had curfews, and there was the threat of violence and people breaking into homes. And so that anxiety reminds me of this anxiety. But what we can do when we have insight is we can diffuse that and do exactly what you just said. We can think about, how is this similar, but also how is it different? And really, the virus that this battle is something that is largely under our control if we take proper precautions. The virus is not like a Hollywood movie. It's not transmitted through a vaporous gas in the air we breathe. It's transmitted by people and contact with surfaces. So if we take precautions, we can go for a walk in the woods, and we can even go to our essential jobs if we're very careful and we take precautions. So it's not the same. And I think if we don't have a perspective on that, we don't get that bird's eye view, then we can be ambushed again and again by anxiety we don't analyze.
So you recently did I know you've written articles for Psychology Today and for the Military Times, and you also recently did a video, I think it was like 10 minutes long, about COVID-19 and giving us some strategies and walking through some particular solid tips. Can you walk us through some of those? Because that was very valuable, and I think our audience really needs to hear some of those things. They probably haven't caught it.
Yeah, sure. Happy to share. So in brief, the 5 things that I put in terms of practical things we can do right now. The first one was take out a sheet of paper, draw a line down the middle On one side, write down the things that are not under your control. And on the other side, write down the things that are under your control. And then take that list and make a plan to act on those things. What that does psychologically is it takes us out of this feeling of helplessness, like we're just sitting there waiting for bad news. And we can put ourselves to work doing something positive. The second idea was to really take the long view. You know, that anxiety creates tunnel vision, as I had said. And so we can think about, you know, in 5 years, how do I want our society to have handled this, and what role do I play as a leader in helping that to happen? You can think historically about, you know, how Londoners responded to the bomb and how they showed a resilient response that became a source of national pride ever since. And to really drive this one home, the way you can make this happen is to think of a wise guide, somebody that you would trust with your children, somebody who's wise and nurturing, and think about how they would handle this crisis. And then take your cues from what you envision. Think about how you can then respond in ways that will make you proud and that will help us build connection, because when we connect, we survive. The third idea was to proactively look to connect with other people. So that's, you know, what I kind of mentioned was make a list of 20 people, add 3 people that are isolated and call them once a day and give them space to talk. Another idea that I had was really don't put yourself in solitary confinement. So this is important because many of us are sheltering in place. And if we stay bunkered in or isolated in our homes, we can fear the very air that we breathe. And so getting outside and getting some fresh air, even if it's just sitting in your backyard and taking in the night sky, is critical right now. Developing that connection with nature and the sense of how we're connected to the bigger world outside of us and not allowing ourselves to be put in solitary confinement is a choice that each of us can make. And the other idea I had was, if you have money, if you have savings, if you are able to do business, do business. The invisible threads that bind us are trust and connection. And doing business is a way of showing that we trust each other to come through this. It will hold our economy stable for us to do business where we can. So that was another point that I really wanted to make, because that's a second order effect of anxiety that we really don't want to miss.
Those are such great, solid tips that we all can do. And as you know, our mutual friend Jamie Mustard and I started the Do Business hashtag. And it's really about understanding, as you just said, that doing business is an act of trust, but it also is an act of inspiration. It's a way of saying, look, you know, we're going to get through this. It's going to be okay. And as you and I know very well, the mind sees everything as absolute, and therefore we're never going to come out of this. And that's just not true. And one of the things that I've been giving people as a tip is to embrace humanity. And the simple, when I say that to people, I say the simplicity of it is this: you may be spending time at home, but you're probably going to go for a walk. And when you go for a walk, even though you're doing social distancing, even though you may cross the street and make sure you don't bump into somebody, there's nothing wrong with looking the person in the eye and say, hey, how you doing? Right? Because that human connection, it takes you out of the mindset that other people are the threat.
Yes.
They're not. The physical touch is a possible threat, but even that's not so much. What we really got to get is, hold on, let me see the humanity. How you doing today? Right?
I am so glad you said that about meeting people's eyes. What I've been noticing out here in California, where people have been sheltered in place, is that when we go out, people are not meeting each other's eyes. They are scared and they're starting to look at each other as a potential threat.
Right.
So one of the sort of tips that I put out in psychology today is to overcome this. You be the person that looks people in the eye and says, how are you doing today?
Exactly.
And really, connecting. Don't wait for someone else to do it, because this is the kind of thing that we could lose if we don't engage in this kind of behavior. We can become very fearful of each other. Doing business is a way of putting hope into action. And meeting people's eyes is a way of saying, I'm willing to trust you.
Yeah.
I'm going to do something that will improve our society. The hidden blessing maybe in this is that we are all going through this together. The president of Harvard University and his wife got COVID-19.
Oh.
Chris Cuomo has COVID-19. Tom Hanks and his wife, COVID-19. So our nurses, our doctors, the people that we consider to be privileged in various ways in our society, we are all in the same boat facing this time of anxiety and crisis. And so we have an opportunity to do something different, but not if we sit in our foxholes and just wait for bad news.
Yeah, and that's such an important point. I did a video that I put out on social media last week, and the headline was, "Go ahead, unfollow or unfriend me." That was the headline. And what it said is, if you're calling this the Chinese flu, please go ahead and unfollow me. Because here's the news. COVID-19 doesn't care what color you are.
Yeah.
It doesn't care what nationality you are. It doesn't care how rich or how poor you are. And it doesn't even care about your borders. So it doesn't care about any of those things. It's irrelevant. And this is the thing we've got to understand, that the COVID-19, if there's an enemy, it's COVID-19. It's not your neighbor. It's not the person of a certain skin type or a certain nationality or a certain faith. It's killing Muslims, it's killing Jews, it's killing Christians, it's killing Hindus, it's killing Buddhists, it's killing black, white, green, yellow, purple stripes. It will kill anybody because that's what it does. It's simply actually a survival mechanism of the virus itself. It's just trying to survive, so it multiplies. And when we can get that, we can step back and go, okay, do I behave? And this is one of the things I've asked people. Are you behaving like the virus? And people go, what do you mean? And I said, are you behaving so like brutally that you don't care who you take down as long as you survive? Because that's what the virus is doing. That's its nature. We're supposed to be these higher thinkers. And if you're moving into that mentality, then you are no better than COVID-19, except that you have a consciousness which really sort of demeans you if you're not doing that. And we need to come together again as humanity and do the things we can do to serve each other.
That's really interesting that you put it that way, Dov. It strikes me that people are mindful, first of all, at times, of whether they might get this virus or whether their loved ones might get this virus. And I think we really need to think ahead, 2 steps ahead, 3 steps ahead, in terms of, could I transfer this virus to somebody else? Could I be somebody who puts vulnerable people or our frontline providers at risk by putting my own rights ahead of everybody else's rights? I did a piece for, hopefully it will come out soon, for a major media outlet on why people are not taking social distancing seriously and what we can do about it. And from what I can tell, there's 2 reasons. People either don't see the threat because germs are invisible and, we don't associate cause and effect and we can't see things, or they see it and they are putting their rights ahead of everybody else. The military is one example. There are many people who are loving and giving, but the military is an example of a group of people that generally knows there are times when you put your rights aside for the good of the whole, and that it's not about you. And I feel like if there was any time in our history, just like you said, where we could all come together and see this as a global threat and come into one tribe to face this global threat, this is the time.
Yeah. It's one of the questions I'm asking everybody that I work with is, I want you to think about, want you to envision 5 years from now. Do you think COVID-19 will still be ruling our lives? And they all say no. And I go, okay, good. So we know this will, in the form that it's in, will go away. We know that things will be different. There's no doubt about that in my mind. But I said, but your life won't be run by COVID-19. And they go, right. And I go, now, my simple question to you, 5 years from now, you're talking to your kids and they say, are you proud of how you behaved during COVID-19?
Exactly.
And if you're not, You
Yep.
need to change your behavior right now because you're a leader. And sometimes people will say, but I'm not a leader. I go, do you have children? They go, yeah. I go, you're a leader.
Yep.
Because leadership is by example. That's all leadership is. You give permission by virtue of how you behave. And if you're behaving like a piece of shit and you're treating people poorly, then that is leadership, and it's not good leadership. And we want to behave in ways that we can be proud of 5 years down the road. Yes, we're all afraid. Yes, we're all threatened. Yes, we're all in some level of trauma or crisis. But the bottom line is, treating other people poorly is not going to help.
Boy, that's so close to something I posted on Psychology Today. About 5 years from now, and we can all be a role model for someone. If we're a parent, we're a role model to our kids. But if we're not a parent, we're a leader to someone. We can use social media to promote an epidemic of hope. And we can use the way we connect with other people to behave in ways that bring us together instead of creating false information or unhelpful fear. There's helpful fear here and there's unhelpful fear.
So talk to our audience about that. The difference between helpful and unhelpful fear, because I think that's something fear's like, it feels like anger. We put it in a box, it goes bad. No, anger's not bad and it's not good. It's anger. Fear, we go, oh, bad. No, it's good and it's bad. Tell us about that.
Sure. So fear can be unhelpful or helpful right now. It can be unhelpful if we feel no fear when we should be thinking about consequences of our behavior for ourselves, our loved ones, and people 5 steps out. So in areas where COVID-19 hasn't hit, where there haven't been outbreaks, there are people that are out and mingling and close together and going to the beach and going to parties and just really not aware that they could transport viruses they don't even know that they have.
Right.
One person in that group could transfer that to a lot of other people. Without their awareness. So there's an appropriate level of fear. We try to minimize our fears by saying things like, well, most people won't get it very severely, or I'm young, I'm healthy, if I get it, it'll be flu-like symptoms for me. Yet nurses that are young and healthy are dying. And I have a Harvard classmate I've been following who just got off a ventilator. He's young, he's athletic, he's healthy.
Wow.
So people don't always fit the profile. And so there's a healthy level of fear that we can have. But more than that, we have to think about the people on the front lines and how our behavior may expose them to a situation where they have to make a decision about who dies and who lives in terms of having limited equipment. Yeah. And that alone is enough for me to make us all go, okay, let's do what we can do to protect that tip of the spear, so that they can take care of the people who are most seriously ill with this.
So if you were to put it into the simplest possible category of good fear, not good fear, what would you say?
Okay, good fear is based on good information that should change our behavior and make us align with the right choice. And bad fear is the fear that is spinning us out of control, that makes our vision tunnel vision, that creates behaviors that cause us to be the person we don't want to be, that will behave in ways that we don't value, we don't want. In 5 years from now, we'll look back on this and we'll say, what was I thinking? Why did I say that? Why did I post that on social media? That was verbal diarrhea. Bad fear results in all of those kind of outcomes.
Yeah, there is a you write about this chronic threat response, and that is different than PTSD. What is the difference, and why does that matter so much right now?
So people, I think, get a lot of hang-ups about diagnosis. Do I have the diagnosis or do I not have a diagnosis? There's something that often happens even for people who don't have a diagnosis of PTSD, where they feel that they are under what I call chronic threat response. So it's some of those symptoms that happen with trauma, specifically having disrupted sleep, having these nightmares, having panic attacks. Many times for those I serve and for leaders, anxiety is expressed as anger. And
Yes.
so anxiety, I'm sure, you've all over this, Dove, that, anger is an easier emotion to express. It feels more powerful in the moment than saying, you know what, I'm very anxious, or I had a panic attack. Instead we get rageful and we spill over on the people around us. That's a hyper arousal symptom. So
Yep.
those hyper arousal symptoms of trauma are part of chronic threat response, as well as a startle response. And interestingly, difficulties with concentration is part of that. So it affects how we think, and
Yes.
it makes us less able to kind of think through options for responding and how we can respond in ways that align with our values as leaders.
So I want to go to that as we sort of move into the last part of the show, because I think it's really important that we get practical here.
Yeah.
And I want to do sort of a back and forward, if that's all right with you, because I think it's really important for us to get practical about how we can deal with this. The first thing I want to say to everybody is, you are going through whatever you're going through. It's not less or more than others, although you'd like to categorize it so. It's yours, and you just got to be with that. And the first thing around that is, as I said, I think there are things we can do around being more human to people and treating people better, so we create a better world rather than a trauma response. And the thing around that is that where I just want to start with people is to say a simple fact: 27% of the blood flow to the neocortex, to the front part of your brain that you use to make decisions, is cut off in trauma, is cut off in high levels of stress, is cut off in what's going on right now. And everything's going to this limbic part of your brain, the old part of your brain, and it's not allowing you to think as well. And one of the ways around that is, there's two specific I'm going to just give you now very quickly. One is breathing, and the other one is writing. And as you just said, Shoma, by naming the anxiety on paper, like actually writing it out by hand, not typing, by hand, utilizes different parts of the brain than typing.
Yes.
By doing that, you allow yourself to, and I call it emotionally vomit. And you give yourself permission to completely emotionally vomit. You give yourself permission to curse and swear and vomit and be irrational on paper rather than living it. Because once it's out, it's not in the recycling unit called your head. Yeah. That's one. And then following that is the breathing, which military-wise is known as box breathing, but it's a Buddhist technique as well. There's all kinds of simple breathing techniques, and the simplest one of all that I will recommend to you is look up into the corner where the walls meet and the ceiling, in that corner, and keep your chin perpendicular to the floor, looking up so your eyes are upwards, and just breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, hold that for as long as you can, and then breathe in for 4, and just keep cycling. That is going to help you to bring your brain back online. So I just want to start with that practicality. I want to go over to you, because I know you would probably recommend those things, but I'm sure you've got way more too.
Well, yeah, that's great though. What you shared is, that box breathing technique is used, as you know, in special forces units. There's 2 ways to re-regulate your system. The first is biological, and the second is psychological.
Yes.
So when you're talking about breathing techniques, what's helping there is that you are down-regulating your system. I've actually gotten involved in some really innovative treatments for trauma and chronic threat response that involves an injection in the neck, where the nerves are kind of going haywire, and this resets the adrenaline system. It reboots your fight or flight system back to baseline. Many people have not heard about this because it's primarily been advanced in the special forces community, but it's based on a pain management procedure that's been around since 1925. I'm actually doing an article for anxiety.org that will come out in about a week about this promising treatment. So that is a biological method to address trauma and anxiety that's highly effective when it works.
What are they injecting?
They're injecting a local anesthetic. So it's the local anesthetic has been used for a long time. That anesthetic is FDA approved. It's safe for use. It's used off-label the way that we take an aspirin for reducing cardiac risk.
Sure.
So it's been used for hundreds of thousands and thousands of patients. In one study alone, in fact, 45,000 patients received this for pain.
And
now
is it being injected into the nerve, or?
There's a cluster of nerves just above the collarbone called the stellate ganglion. And the stellate ganglion block injects a local anesthetic into that cluster of nerves. It has a short-term effect in the sense of like Novocaine when you go to the dentist. It doesn't stay in your system. But what it does is it resets and reboots the fight or flight system. So that's something, that's been game-changing for many of the veterans that I've worked with the leading physician, Dr. Lipov, that pioneered this treatment. So that is, for the first responders and for people that are overwhelmed by this chronic threat response, that is something that I think could really come into play as a valuable treatment. You can't get it at home. I'm not suggesting that people jab, themselves in the neck. So, the breathing.
Please don't do that.
Please.
You did not hear that from me or from Dr. Shauna. No, you're not suggesting that at all.
Go to the world's experts.
Please.
Please. But the breathing and the down regulation, using that kind of strategy is the physical. And then the psychological, what you're talking about there is really getting your brain to think up here instead of at the back of your brain, where the reptilian brainstem lives. So the reptilian brainstem is that primitive fight or flight, I'm going to die, so I'm going to annihilate the threat now. And our brain doesn't really code our partner, our spouse, as the person we said was our soulmate for life. They're just the threat that needs to go now. There is that. So what you're doing with the psychological side, when you write about it, is you're calming yourself.
Yes.
By taking your thoughts, putting them out, and then driving your thinking to the front of your brain, our most evolved part of our brain, where we think about options. And in terms of leadership, it's no coincidence, I think, that we name that the executive functioning center. An executive in a company is somebody that ought to think of strategies for responding, that should be in control, and that should be running that thing from the best part of their brain. And so what you're doing there is you're driving your thoughts into that executive functioning center, where we weigh our values and how we can respond in ways that honor those values and protect those we love.
So now we're going to jump forward and assume the leaders that we're talking to are writing out the emotional vomit that needs to come out. They are doing the breathing they need to do. But at the same time, they're now dealing with the people they have to lead who are in panic. Those people they're leading might be now remote workers, but they could just as easily be a wife or a husband or children or adult children or whatever it is. What's your guidance to the leaders who are having to lead people who are in those responses? Yeah.
So it goes back to what you said, actually, which is about the blood flow decrease to the brain when we're in anxiety mode. And so one of the things that we must do, I think, as leaders is to manage our own anxiety. And the way that we do that is by acknowledging it, even privately, writing this down. Because what that will do is it will just kind of allow us to calm down enough to see solutions and strategies and options for responding. So many times in my therapy practice for many years, I've had couples that are, at each other's throats, and then we just calm down, and then the solution is very clear to both of them. So I don't spend a lot of time thinking of these brilliant strategies and solutions for my clients and my patients. It was really about helping them to regulate their own bodies and to reckon with their own issues to the degree that they could, so that they can see the options for responding. And once you've done that enough times, you've dealt with your own stuff, like you said, then you know how to help other people do it. And you have the moral credibility to take the people you lead through a similar process. You can say, Cliff Notes version, I had a lot of feelings of anxiety. I felt like I, was letting people down. I felt responsible for things I couldn't control. I wrote it all down, and then I realized here's something we can control. So here's what we're going to do as a company. And you model that process and help people to do that for themselves. Because when people are calm and connected, they come up with brilliant ways to adapt and overcome.
Fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. Really is. Shauna, this has been an absolute pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much, because you've added a ton of value to our listeners and to our viewers. And it's really important for everybody to, as I always say, please don't listen to this, because information is worth the hole in the donut. Apply it. Yeah. Information without application is worth the hole in the donut. So transformation comes from the application. So go away. Please listen to this. Take some notes, preferably by hand, and think about what you can do, because there is so much we can do, and there's some we can't do. And part of the reality of it is to know the distinction between the two, which I know you are very strong about. So before we finish up, I would love for you to share with our listeners and our viewers where they can find out more about you and all the wonderful resources that you have available, because you're not just exclusively available to the military. I know you work with a lot of leaders and corporate leaders and executives, and you're helping them because they are now frontline with their businesses as well. So please share.
Yeah, thank you. I take what I've learned from working with military leaders and those who have been in extreme situations, and I apply it to help leaders and people across America develop insight. I like to say something very similar, which is that insight without action is worthless. And it's kind of along the lines of what you just shared. So applying these insights does become critical. People can learn more about me and what I offer at DocShaunaSpringer.com, which is www.DocShaunaSpringer.com. I'm available right now. I'm doing a lot of work with writing and media pieces, available to comment on things and help develop insight and action plans at scale. I'm not taking any private patients at this point. Just really want to use what I've learned to help people develop those insights and actions that will move us through this.
And we definitely encourage you to go to DocShaunaSpringer.com. Go there, have a look around. Of course, we'll post that into the show notes. Again, I want to sincerely thank you for all that you've shared. It was an honor, and we are really grateful for everything that you've offered us. And I want to ask you to stay with us to the end. For you, dear listener, you can hang out with other conscious leaders and chat about this episode or any past episodes by going into our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Simply look for the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. It doesn't matter how successful you are. If your employees and your customers don't understand what gives your company meaning, you're likely only working at a fraction of your capability. To find out how you can hire me, Dov Baron, as a speaker or leadership strategist for yourself or your organization, go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. Because unified meaning, or as we call it, finding your dragonfire, is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness in all individuals and in companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about what you can actually do right now, where you're actually in power and in control. And I'm going to encourage you to share the hashtag that Dr. Shauna brought up with us, and that is epidemic of hope. Hashtag epidemic of hope. I love that. Let's do that. Let's create an epidemic of hope, because this will not last. And you need to stay curious about how you're going to see yourself, how your children and your friends are going to see you in 5 years from now. Be the leader you would want to be inspired by. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your dragonfire to reach the next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.